艾玛 Emma 是《傲慢与偏见》的作者简奥斯汀 Jane Austen 的另一篇长篇小说。艾玛是个上流社会的富家女，在她的村庄海伯里举足轻重。她善良、热心自负。文章描述了当时英国社会的爱情婚姻。该作品被多次搬上荧幕。
Chapter 10 The Ball. It was the day of the ball, and the weather was wet. Frank Churchill had arrived at the Westons' house, Randall's, before dinner. He heard that everything was ready. All the arrangements for the ball had been made. There was no time for him to visit the Woodhouses at Hartfield that day. Emma and Frank would meet at the ball itself. "There will be a crowd of people there," Emma thought. "That will be better. I shall be able to hide my feelings about Frank." Mr. Woodhouse was not going to the ball. Emma had invited his old friends, Mrs. Bates and Mrs. Goddard, to Hartfield. The three old people would enjoy a quiet dinner and a game of cards together. Emma and Harriet arrived at the Crown Inn before most of the other guests. The Westons and Frank Churchill were already there. The friends saw that everything was ready. Although it was May, it was a cold evening, and a warm fire was burning in the fireplace in the ballroom. It was still raining outside, but inside the inn, all the rooms were warm and comfortable. In the card room and supper room there were tables and chairs. There were many lighted candles everywhere. The musicians were ready to play. Everything was perfect. Everything was ready for the Westons' guests. Frank smiled at Emma, but he did not stay near her for long. He was very restless. He hurried to the door each time that he heard the sound of a carriage outside. The Eltons were the first couple to arrive. Mrs. Elton's dress and her necklace of pearls were very elegant. "Where are Miss Bates and Miss Fairfax?" Mr. Weston said. "I thought that they were coming with you, Mrs. Elton." Mrs. Elton had forgotten to call at the Bateses' house and bring Miss Fairfax and Miss Bates with her. Immediately, Mr. Weston sent his own carriage to bring the ladies to the inn. Frank went to the door of the inn to wait for them. He took an umbrella with him. "Your son is a fine young man, Mr. Weston," Mrs. Elton said. "He is so well-mannered and so handsome, too. You must be very proud of him." Mr. Weston was always happy to hear praise of his son, and he agreed with everything that Mrs. Elton said. Frank himself soon returned, bringing with him Miss Bates and Jane Fairfax. Miss Bates came into the room smiling and talking as usual. "It was so kind of Mr. Weston to send his carriage," she cried. "No, we are not wet. Just a little rain. Mr. Churchill had an umbrella. What bright candles! What a beautiful room! I never thought... Yes, my mother is well. She is with Mr. Woodhouse. She is wearing her new warm shawl. It was a present from Mrs. Dixon. She bought it in Weymouth. They are all so kind. Mr. Churchill is so kind too, bringing an umbrella for us. Oh dear, Miss Woodhouse, how fine you look. Do you like Jane's hairstyle? She arranged it herself. She is so clever. No coffee, thank you. Perhaps some tea. Oh, thank you. Yes, I shall sit down, here in this chair. Then I shall be out of the way." Frank went and stood next to Emma. Mrs. Elton walked across the room to where Jane Fairfax was standing. She began to praise Jane's hairstyle and her dress. "And what do you think of my dress?" Mrs. Elton went on. "I believe my pearls are the finest in the room. I hear that Mr. Frank Churchill is a very good dancer. Well, we shall see. Do you like Mrs. Elton? Emma asked Frank very quietly. I do not like her at all, Frank replied. But she is praising you, Emma said with a smile. Mrs. Elton thinks that you are very handsome. Frank did not answer. He was looking round the room for Mr. Weston. Where is my father? Frank said. When are we going to begin dancing? Mr. Weston walked across the ballroom to speak to his son. Mrs. Elton must have a dancing partner. She will expect you to dance with her first, Frank, he said. Frank shook his head. No, father, I am sorry. I have made a promise to Miss Woodhouse. We are dancing the first dance together, he said. You can be Mrs. Elton's partner, father. You can lead the dance with her. She will like that. Several couples were now standing ready, and the dancing began. Mr. Weston stood first in the line with Mrs. Elton. Emma and Frank Churchill were next to them. Emma was feeling very happy. She knew that she was well dressed and elegant, and she knew that she and Mr. Frank Churchill danced well together. Emma saw Mr. Knightley standing and talking to some other guests. It is a pity that Mr. Knightley is not dancing, she thought. He looks so tall and handsome. He is the most handsome man in the room, after Frank Churchill. Harriet Smith was not dancing either, and Emma felt sorry for her. Mrs. Weston did too. Mr. Elton was walking about the room without a dancing partner, and Mrs. Weston spoke to him. You are not dancing, Mr. Elton, she said. Shall I find you a partner for the next dance? Mr. Elton smiled. I would be happy to dance with you, Mrs. Weston, he said politely. I do not dance, Mrs. Weston said with a laugh. But here is Miss Harriet Smith, a very pretty girl without a partner for the next dance. She would be happy to dance with you, I am sure. Thank you, but I do not need a partner, Mr. Elton said quickly. I am an old married man, and my dancing days are over. Mr. Elton turned away from Harriet and went to sit down. Emma was angry at Mr. Elton's rudeness, and she felt very sorry for Harriet. Then, to Emma's surprise, Mr. Knightley walked over to Harriet, bowed, and asked her to dance. Harriet stood up, smiling happily. Emma was pleased. Mr. Knightley had shown kindness to her friend. Emma was also pleased to see that Mr. Knightley danced very well. She smiled happily as the musicians played another tune. Some time later, it was time for supper. The delicious food was put on tables in the supper room, and people began to walk along the passage. They were laughing and talking. Miss Bates walked with Jane, and of course, Miss Bates was talking too. Jane, dear Jane, please put on this shawl. The passage may be cold. Oh, Mr. Churchill, there you are. Jane, dear, Mr. Churchill has helped you. You are so kind, Mr. Churchill. Jane, you will be warmer now. I am so pleased to watch the dancing. Yes, Jane dear, Mr. Woodhouse sent Grandmamma back from Hartfield in his carriage. I ran home to help her into bed. No one missed me. And here I am, back again. Grandmamma had such a good evening with Mr. Woodhouse. Dinner, cards, and then tea. Oh, thank you, Mr. Churchill. You are kind to help Jane and myself. Oh, but Mrs. Elton must go to the supper table first. She is wearing a very elegant dress. Here are 2 steps. Take care, Jane. Oh, just 1 step. Your grandmamma was a little disappointed, dear. There was her favourite food at dinner, but Mr. Woodhouse sent it back to the kitchen. He said that it was not cooked enough. Well, look at all this delicious food. We must tell Grandmamma all about it. Thank you, Mr. Churchill. You have given me too much food on this plate. It looks delicious. After supper, Mr. Knightley spoke to Emma about Mr. Elton's rudeness to Harriet Smith. The Eltons are your enemies, Emma, Mr. Knightley said. I think that you wanted Mr. Elton to marry Harriet. Am I right? Yes, I did want Mr. Elton and Harriet to marry, and the Eltons cannot forgive me, Emma replied. Well, I do not agree with your matchmaking, but Harriet was the better choice for Mr. Elton, Mr. Knightley said. Harriet Smith is a sweet, kind girl. These are good qualities, but Mrs. Elton has no good qualities at all. Soon, Mr. Weston was asking everyone to begin dancing again. Come along, Emma, he cried. Show everyone what to do. I am ready, Emma said happily. Who are you going to dance with? Mr. Knightley asked her. With you, if you will ask me, Emma replied with a smile. Will you, Emma? Of course I will, Mr. Knightley. You have shown me that you can dance, Emma said, smiling. We are not brother and sister, are we, Mr. Knightley? We are very good friends. Brother and sister? Certainly not, he replied.